Title: The Pact in the Gaze. Blackwood Manor had always possessed an aura of mystery, but ever since the portrait arrived in the library, the atmosphere had become dense, oppressive. It was an imposing piece, an oil painting of a stern-faced man, dark eyes that seemed to follow you around the room. James, a young historian obsessed with the occult, had inherited the mansion from a distant uncle he never knew. The library, with its shelves overflowing with old and dusty volumes, became his sanctuary. But the portrait disturbed him. At first, it was just an uncomfortable feeling, the impression of being watched. But with each passing day, the gaze of the man in the painting became more intense, more penetrating. James began to avoid the library, but the portrait seemed to call to him, drawing him in with an invisible force. One night, while working late, James felt a chill run down his spine. He looked up and met the gaze of the man in the painting. This time, it wasn't just a static image. There was something different, a spark of life in those dark eyes. "I know what you're thinking. What you're feeling. I'm waiting for you." James stumbled back, his heart pounding. It couldn't be real. It had to be a product of his imagination, of exhaustion. But the voice was unmistakable, real. From that night on, the presence of the man in the portrait became more evident. James began to have vivid nightmares, dreams in which he was pursued by a shadowy figure with the same penetrating eyes as the painting. The shadows in the library seemed to move on their own, lengthening and contorting into grotesque shapes. One night, as he walked through the library, he noticed the portrait glowing faintly. A spectral light emanated from the man's eyes, illuminating a section of the wall behind the painting. Approaching, James discovered a crack, a barely visible fissure that seemed to open a pathway to another dimension. Curiosity, and perhaps a touch of desperation, drove him to investigate. Carefully, he slid the portrait aside, revealing a dark and deep opening in the wall. An icy wind blew from within, bringing with it a stench of sulfur and decay. "Welcome, James. You have found the way." Without a second thought, James stepped into the opening. Instantly, the library disappeared, replaced by a desolate and twisted landscape. Gnarled trees rose towards a cloudy sky, their branches reaching out like skeletal claws. The ground was covered in bones and skulls, and the air reeked of death. In the distance, he saw a figure standing on a hill. It was the man from the portrait, now fully alive, with a sinister smile on his face. "You have accepted the pact," said the man, his voice booming across the landscape. "Now you belong to me." James tried to step back, but it was too late. The man raised a bony hand and spoke words in an ancient and unknown language. Instantly, James's body felt heavy, as if it were being consumed by a dark force. The man from the portrait approached, his eyes glowing with a malevolent intensity. "I have been waiting for you for centuries, James. Now, you will help me open the gates to this world and reclaim what is rightfully mine." With horror, James realized that the portrait was not just a painting, but a portal, a gateway to an infernal dimension. And he, unwittingly, had released an ancient and malevolent entity that had been trapped for centuries. In the following days, James was transformed into a servant of the man in the portrait, forced to obey his orders and help him carry out his plans. Blackwood Manor became a hub of paranormal activity, a place of darkness and terror where souls were tortured and the boundaries between worlds blurred. A group of paranormal investigators, alerted by the strange events at the mansion, arrived to investigate. However, one by one, they fell under the control of the man in the portrait, becoming his slaves. Finally, only one investigator remained, Sarah, a brave and determined young woman who was unwilling to surrender. Armed with occult knowledge and a strong will, Sarah confronted the man in the portrait in the library. After an epic battle, Sarah managed to weaken the man in the portrait, but she could not destroy him completely. The only way to stop him was to close the portal, thus sealing the infernal dimension forever. With a final effort, Sarah destroyed the portrait, closing the portal and banishing the man in the portrait back to his world. Blackwood Manor returned to normal, but the scars of the experience would remain forever. Sarah, traumatized but determined, dedicated herself to protecting the world from the dark forces that lurked in the shadows. She knew that the man in the portrait had not been the only one, and that the fight against evil would never end. But as she walked through the empty library, Sarah felt a gaze on her back. She turned and saw a shadow on the wall, a shadow with the same penetrating eyes as the man in the portrait. The nightmare was not over. It had only just begun.